This is Conspirinormal.
Welcome, everybody. Flying by myself on this episode because Sergio is out of town. But tonight, we've got a very interesting show, and we're going to talk again to W.T. Watson, who was on the show. We figured it out back in March, talking about his book, Mysteries in the Mist. And tonight, we're going to talk about Canadian monsters and mysteries. So welcome back, W.T. Welcome back to the show.
Go by WT when I'm writing stuff, but on podcasts, I'm Travis. Travis is fine.
Excellent.
And thanks for having me again, Adam.
Absolutely. I enjoyed having you last time. And sometimes I like to have you as WT Watson because I don't want to say Travis Walton because it's really confusing.
Yeah, no, I have not been sucked up into any alien spacecraft.
Good.
I will issue that disclaimer right now.
You weren't gone for 5 days and then
no, I am not now, nor have I ever been related to this individual.
All right. Good to know, you guys. You heard it first on Conspirinormal that they're not one and the same person.
No.
Totally different. But you do write about interesting stuff, and you do actually write about UFOs, which I think in this interview we're gonna focus primarily on the monster aspect, the cryptid aspect of this, and I want to get a little bit into the fairy lore stuff too.
Okay.
In Canada, because that's interesting as well. But like I said, this book is called Canadian Monsters and Mysteries, and the first question I have is, what prompted you to write a book just specifically about monsters / cryptids in Canada?
So, just a little backstory there. I actually moved to Canada in 2020. My spouse got a job at a university here. And of course, I was regaling you with the tale of our
yes.
pandemic move.
Now, she is Canadian, correct?
Originally from Welland, Ontario. Yes.
Gotcha.
Of course, you move to a new place and you're getting your feet down and you're in the middle of a pandemic and you can't work anywhere. And because you're still a guest in the country, right? So what do? You do some research, right? And I started thinking to myself, okay, well, I've written, I launched Mysteries in the Mist after I got here, but I also was sitting and thinking to myself, well, God, I wonder what kind of fun weirdness happens up here in Canada. I mean, there's bound to be something, right? So I started doing research, as I told you earlier, this broad brush kind of looking at different things and seeing, maybe what I could shape a book out of. And I quickly realized that there was so much stuff that I was going to have to really limit the scope of the book. Because, for instance, we want to talk about Sasquatch. Everybody loves Sasquatch, right? That's going to end up being a whole book of itself. In fact, there's so much material accumulating right now, it may end up being more than one book. You could do an entire book on hauntings in Ontario. And just in Ontario, just the one province, without going, all throughout Canada. So what I discovered was I was going to have to limit the scope of the book, and so I wanted to look at some of my favorite monsters like Dogman and stuff like that. I wanted to see if there was anything unusual in Canada, and boy, is there. Of course, there's always UFOs to consider, and there's a considerable section on UFOs in the book. And there's also a great deal of fairy lore, which is particularly the case in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, which are on the Atlantic coast, Atlantic provinces. So just those things, and lake monsters, of course. I got to think that Canada's got one of the highest percentage of lake monsters in the world.
Yeah, from reading the book, it seems very much like that there's a lot.
They are. Yeah, they are all the way from the West Coast all the way across to the East Coast. Every single province that I looked in had some kind of a lake monster story. So there's a good bit of lake monster lore for those who like their cryptids, swimming. But, again, as I said, it really was, I had to narrow the scope of the book, and these are the kinds of the things that I chose to do, but there's lots of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely, you cover a lot of bases in this, and I can definitely see how Sasquatch would have been probably taken over the whole book. So you're working now on or doing the research for another book of just purely about Canadian Sasquatch, Bigfoot.
Yeah, that book is due to the publisher in December. The working title right now is Beyond BC, because when everybody thinks of Sasquatch, they think, yeah, British Columbia. Everything happens in British Columbia. But what people don't realize is that Canada has vast, and I mean vast, this is the second largest country in the world, right?
Right.
Vast swaths of wilderness, stretching from one side of the country to the other, and there are Sasquatch reports in just about every province, particularly in places like Manitoba, Alberta, Ontario. There's just huge numbers of sightings, and people, for the most part, don't know that, because if you go and you look through the standard cryptozoology texts that most of us think of, you might find a Canadian sighting here, Canadian sighting there. Everybody seems to be enamored of yellowtop up in the Cobalt area of Ontario. For some reason, that one seems to make it into a lot of Sasquatch books. But there's this huge pool of witnesses here in Canada that their stories don't really get told, unless they happen to be on one of the podcasts or something like that. So I want to get into that. I'm still in the process of researching. I'm still in the process of narrowing down my scope. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to write about maybe 2-3 provinces for this particular book. So I'm trying to figure out which ones I want to do this time. But I'm accumulating data all throughout the country, and it's fascinating stuff.
Wow.
I need to have a whole chapter titled "Why Did the Bigfoot Cross the Road?"
Well, it seems like you might be able to get more than one book out of that material.
Yeah, it's entirely possible.
Yeah.
Because I'm just maybe a month into the research for this, so it's still new, and I've got a pile of stuff already. I probably could sit down and write a book right now, but I want to get a little bit more in depth here. So,
well, let's talk a little bit about the way you structure the book is like really simple stuff all the way down to the more fantastical.
Mm-hmm.
And you start off with something like animals that don't belong. Animals that you would not see that are native to Canada, which obviously is a phenomenon in the United States as well. But what are some of those that you found particularly interesting as you were going through the process of writing this book that you found like, well, that's really just kind of baffling?
Oh, there's all kinds of just weird animal sightings up here. There have been reports of kangaroos in Newfoundland. Mm-hmm. There was a report of an African lion actually being seen here in Ontario. And of course, you have the ubiquitous, they call them ABCs, alien big cats in Britain, what people call black panthers here, or in the States. I don't even know what they call them up here. But and those range from the very interesting, oh, look, there's a large black cat and it's wandering through the woods out back of my place or whatever, to the individual, and I can't remember what province this happened in. It seems like it was in the Atlantic provinces somewhere. Fellas walking home one night, he's been out cutting wood. He's got his axe with him, and he's walking down a path, and he hears this bizarre noise, right? Turns and discovers this Black Panther-like creature following him, right? So he picks up his pace a little bit, and this thing comes for him. And as it comes for him, allegedly it stands up on 2 feet and comes at him swinging paws, right? Like it's trying to gouge him. So he fights this thing off with his axe, runs for it. It goes back into the bush. He runs for it, gets a little ways down the road, the thing comes after him again, 2 feet, batting its paws at him and so forth. He fights it off with his axe again. So this happens 3 times on the way home. Yeah. So you got a Black Panther that's bipedal that's chasing this fellow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, we can get into the whole, okay, this is really weird. I mean, I make a kind of facetious comment in the book that maybe the alien big cats are trying to get into the man-wolf business, because the whole bipedal canid thing has been all the rage since Linda Godfrey popped the Beast of Bray Road, right?
Yeah, we're going to talk we're definitely going to talk about that, but for sure.
So we're talking. So as far as aliens that don't, or aliens.
Well, they are aliens. I mean,
they are aliens.
If they're
because they don't
native.
belong.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So you get like I said, you get all these different, just strange kangaroos. Where does it? One of the people that reported seeing a kangaroo was actually a police officer here in the Toronto area. Mm-hmm. Now. I don't know how many police officers but I've known quite a few in my lifetime because of work that I've done. There is no way that any officer anywhere is going to get on the radio and tell his dispatcher that he's looking at a kangaroo unless he's looking at a kangaroo. Because this guy caught all kinds of crap from his colleagues when he got back to the station. Yeah. But sure enough, this guy's reporting seeing kangaroo, and of course they go through the whole thing that nothing was found. The zoo wasn't missing any animals or any of that kind of stuff. There's kangaroo bouncing around somewhere. Now, where did it come from? I suppose it could be an escapee from some exotic animal collector, but they have pretty strict regulations on that stuff here. So, again, it's a mystery. This is why we do this stuff, because there's mysteries and we just love them, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the kangaroo stuff is weird. I mean, that's Jerome Clark writes about that in his famous kind of unexplained book. And there's even, I think there's even a picture that he publishes in that. I think that's in the United States, but I didn't run across that. I know at least one of my kangaroo reports came from Lauren Coleman. So yeah.
I think it may have been Mysterious America.
Yeah, he cites Coleman a lot in that book over many different things, so that wouldn't be surprising. But I mean that is strange, and and also too, I mean, Canada's a pretty cold country, and as far as I know, where kangaroos live, it doesn't get that cold. So I don't know how they would, big cats, I could see. I mean, they could be pretty resourceful, and they could probably survive a Canadian winter. I mean, you guys do have, are there mountain lions? I mean, I'm sure there's mountain lions in the west of Canada.
Yeah. One of the things that reminds me, thanks for saying that. One of the interesting things that popped up in my research about big cats is that the Department of Natural Resources, I think it's called, but I could be wrong, here in Ontario, did an extensive survey trying to determine whether or not there were mountain lions in Ontario. And they released this humongous report that, included witness testimony and, scat evidence and all this other stuff, basically saying, well, yes, there are actually mountain lions in Ontario. because there was the fear that that those critters had gone extinct from overhunting and all that sort of thing. The interesting thing about this, though, is that in the course of this report, there's basically a footnote that says that during the time period that we were doing this report, we spoke to X number of credible witnesses who stated that they had seen black mountain lions. And then it goes on, just, yeah, people saw black mountain lions, like 50 people or something reported black mountain lions. Now, your zoologist will tell you there is no such thing, that mountain lions are not melanistic. They do not come in black. So what were people seeing? There is such a thing as a black jaguar, but what would a jaguar be doing up in Ontario? That's way out of their range. I could believe it, in Texas or in some of the southern states or whatever. They could have come up from Mexico. It's possible. They're known to migrate or move around. But Canada, the only way that I could think of that a black jaguar could possibly make it up here would be if they came up the Mississippi Valley. And there's a lot of land and a lot of farmers with guns and stuff in between there and Canada. So I can't explain that one.
It's unusual and out of place, and it doesn't make much sense. And one thing about the mountain lions is just as an aside, I mean, here in the eastern part of Tennessee, the Smoky Mountains, that area, Appalachians, there are mountain lions.
Yes.
But they're not supposed to be where I am in the middle part of Tennessee, where Nashville is. But there are.
But they are. Yeah.
So because cats like to roam, and that's pretty much the definition of a cat.
Yeah, and you have that same situation if from what I've read, and heard from people in Pennsylvania. They're whatever DNR or whatever is, adamant that there are no, there's no natural breeding population of mountain lions in Pennsylvania. And anybody who hunts there will tell you that's just a load of crap. It's whether they're being lazy about it, whether they don't want to, worry about, protected species existing in their forests or, whatever. There's reasons why the government might fib about finding mountain lions, but they do. Right.
Let's talk a little bit about also like kind of like these unknowns that these are not just animals that don't belong, but these are just like inexplicable animals. And you divide this into cold-blooded unknowns, which obviously we're talking about amphibians, reptiles, and warm-blooded unknowns. This is stuff that's, pretty much stuff that's of unusual size. And one of the examples that I picked out for the cold-blooded was like these giant snakes. And this is bizarre too, because much like the jaguar that lives in a tropical climate, essentially, or a subtropical climate, giant snakes, I mean, here in the United States, like pythons, large boas, I mean, those, we can account where those come from. They're invasive now, especially in Florida. But like up there in Canada, that's again, I'm not seeing it,
So, not only do we have these sort of cryptid creatures like the giant snakes and stuff, which I'll get back to in a minute, but there's also a whole section in the book about creatures that aren't supposed to exist still, that are supposed to be extinct. And, there have been reports from Canada, for instance, of people tracking, what the native people claimed was actually a woolly mammoth up in the Arctic areas of Canada. And there's some interesting reports from that area, which is really bizarre, like the Northwest Territories, which is not a hospitable place for any kind of a reptile, right? It's also a report of actual living dinosaurs up there. something called a ceratosaurus, I think it was called. Hunting party encountered this monstrous beast wandering around out on the tundra. It scared some moose away from them, right? So there's stories about that in the book. But my favorite things that I discovered when I was doing this research, there's a gentleman named John Worms, who people may or may not have heard of. He's a Canadian fellow, lives in Manitoba. I honestly don't know if he's still alive or not. But he wrote a book in the early 2000s called Strange Creatures Seldom Seen. Not something you can find on Amazon. I found it on, basically there's a website that sells, you can get a PDF copy of it, or I think there's another format that they sell it in. I think you can get an EPUB version that you can put on your Kindle or whatever. It's worth every penny because there are some fantastic stories in this book. And Worms got involved in his research because he was trying to solve the mysteries of these big holes people were finding out in the Canadian wilderness. Now, he apparently had an in with the First Nations people in Manitoba, because a lot of the witnesses in this book are First Nations people, which adds to the credibility for me because, these are people who hunt and fish, not just, for a living, not for capital gain, but for survival. They know the animals and the birds and so forth that exist in their area, and they know things that don't exist in their area. So Worms was trying to solve the mystery of these giant holes, right? There's these big holes about 3 feet in diameter, smooth-sided, looked like something had bored right through there, right? He'd consulted with geologists, and they told him that it wasn't a natural formation, and he did all this research trying to figure out what these things were. Finally, he asked some of his First Nations friends, "Well, you know anything about these holes?" He said, "Oh yeah, the giant snakes live in there." He's like, "What?" "Oh yeah, we have these great big snakes up here." He's like, now Worms points out that if you talk to a mainstream herpetologist, a guy who does snakes, right, mm-hmm. that they will tell you that there's no snake species in Canada that's longer than, say, 3 or 4 feet long, right? And that's a big snake up here.
Right.
The natives are like, nah, we have these great big snakes that live up here. It's like, and so he started collecting stories of these giant snakes, right? And he was collecting stories from people who had, been close enough to these things to shoot at them, and who had run into them in boats. That one of the things that you see very frequently with these things is they live close to water, and they do swim. So there may be some crossover between the giant snakes and the whole lake monster thing too. But so, he's getting reports of, snakes that are 20, 30, 40 feet long. And in Canada, that is impossible, according to mainstream science.
We're talking stuff that's like from the Amazon. I mean, that's what And some of that's even like pushing it for as long as snakes can get there.
Yeah. So, some of the snakes that are being described to Worms, would fall firmly into the whole Titanoboa category that people were thinking about, explaining some of these really giant supposed reptiles in the Amazon, right? Now, the Amazonians obviously have anacondas, which can get to be, 30 feet or so. Thereabouts, 28, 30 feet, something like that. But these native people are telling him straight-faced, there's these giant snakes and they live up here. And not the really weird part about it is not only are they describing a giant snake, but they're telling him that there's more than one species of these things.
Yeah.
That, that there are giant snakes that look basically like giant garter snakes.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've seen a garter snake. It's like, where the hell do you get a 20-foot long garter snake from? Did it eat its Wheaties? Did it, is it a radioactive mutation? I mean, what the heck? It sounds like something from a science fiction movie, right?
And they're so blasé about it. They're so just like, it's just we got these big snakes.
So here's the funny part about it. So they tell him, okay, there's these giant snakes, and they live, close to the water, and they hibernate in those big holes that you're talking about. He's like, well, snakes don't really dig. He said, where'd the holes come from? Oh, the giant beavers dig them.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, wait, what? We have like really giant beavers up here. And he thought they were pulling his leg, right? But no, he has, over a dozen witness accounts of people who've seen beavers the size of black bears or bigger.
That's a big beaver.
In fact, he has a picture in the book of him. Somebody's made a statue of one of these things, right? He's standing next to it, kind of with his arms draped over his shoulder. It's shoulder height to him. And this thing is supposed to represent the actual size of one of these things. Native people are telling him, oh yeah, you go out to this area over here and you'll find beaver lodges that are the size of people's houses. He's like, seriously? Okay. As it turns out, I might have put this in the extinct, animals area if I had, if there was some evidence for this, but there was actually a species of giant beaver that was about that size that existed something like 10,000 years ago. It's called Castorides ohioensis.
Right.
But it is, again, supposed to be extinct. And these native people are telling him straight up, not only have they seen these things, but they've actually trapped them, skinned them, and sold the pelts.
That's a good haul. That's a good haul.
That's a heck of a haul.
You just got to find a giant beaver. But other than that,
you got to find a giant beaver. So, again, he collects a number of tales of these giant beavers, giant beavers going into the water. And apparently these things not only eat, they're not just vegetarians, they might eat fish too, because there's one report where a native couple saw one of these beavers go into the water, and as they did, all the fish in the area just kind of jumped out of the water, right? It was like on a fountain, right? Trying to get away from this thing. So it's entirely possible they're supplementing their diet with fish. Something that big, I can believe it. They become more omnivorous, right? So Worms was like, okay, I've got reports of giant snakes. I've got reports of giant beavers up here in Manitoba. He has a whole section on the fairy lore in that area too, which was really interesting. But he's like, I'd really like to see one of these things. So on a lark, and you have to wonder if he wasn't having a moment of intuition, right? On a lark, he decides he's going to camp out next to a river, close to a place where somebody had a recent sighting. And he's, sitting there next to his fire. He's doing his thing. He's camping out. He doesn't really expect to see anything, right? What are the chances? He does. He actually has a witness sighting of one of these giant beavers in the water. It's like 6 or 7 feet long, head the size of a football. He writes it up in the book, and it's like, I had to kind of rethink what I thought about beavers after seeing this thing, because it was humongous, right? So that the giant beavers thing, it's just so Canadian.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
I just really got a kick out of that, and the people that tell these stories are people, like I said, who hunt and fish and trap, to feed their families. They know the wildlife in their area. So if one of these people tells me they've seen a giant snake or they've seen a giant beaver or whatever, I'm inclined to believe them.
So there's two possibilities with these things. Is that maybe a population of this Castoroides ohioensis survived,
Right.
are you dealing with something that's a little more supernatural?
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing about both the giant snakes and the giant beavers is that the elders in the First Nations tribes in that area, are very firm with their people about not really talking about these things.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing that Worms got as much witness testimony as he did. Not really talking about these things and leaving them alone. The person who traps one or shoots at one or whatever is the exception to the rule. For the most part, there's a story about these two First Nations firefighters who come across one of these giant snakes as they're doing a brush clearing project, and one of them's like, "Hey, we should take this thing home with us, and show it to people." And the other guy's like, we're not touching that thing. You just back away slowly and walk away. So you get kind of the impression that the First Nations folks view these creatures as something more than just a natural animal. But who knows? As you say, it's just it could just as easily be a relic population of these giant beavers from not too long ago. The giant snakes, all bets are off on that one. There's absolutely no scientifically explainable reason why you would have a snake that big up here in Canada.
Here's one that was an interesting story from the book, the water moose.
Oh yeah, the underwater moose.
Right.
And don't ask me to pronounce that name. I have no idea how it's pronounced. But there is, according to, again, the native folks, this also comes from Strange Creatures Seldom Seen. There is a species of moose that supposedly lives underwater. And it has a somewhat different look to it than your normal moose that you think of when you think of Canada. It's supposed to have more of a pot belly, a little bit shorter legs, and it has a pouch underneath its throat that Worms theorizes is kind of like its gill sac. And there are there's a good witness account of some people that saw one of these things just pop up out of the water in the middle of the lake somewhere, which is not something moose do. If they swim on the top of the water. They don't go diving, right? This thing pops up in the middle of the lake, and they're like, "Hey, we're out of meat. We should snag this dude, and we'll be set for the rest of the fishing season here." So after some travail and almost getting a hole punched in the side of their aluminum boat by the antlers on this thing, they managed to drop a rope over the antlers. And this sounds very inhumane, but apparently it's fairly common for people to actually, if they don't have a gun or some other way to dispatch the moose, to just drag it to death, right?
Mm-hmm.
To drown it, to get the meat. Well, they're trying to drag this thing and it won't drown. It took them quite some time before the moose finally succumbed. And then when they pulled it up onto land, it required significantly more people to get this thing onto the shore than it would have a regular moose. They took pictures of it, and Worms includes some pictures in the book. I'm not an expert on moose, but the thing looks strange to me. They testified that when they butchered this thing and they were able to survive on the meat for the rest of the season. It tasted like moose meat to them. I guess Worms got a sample of this and actually sent it to some people, and basically all anybody could tell him was that they thought maybe it was a hybrid with one of the Eurasian moose. So it had some sort of genetic anomalies to it. So was this thing some kind of a mutant, or do you indeed have underwater moose in Canada? Wouldn't that be interesting? You go fishing and you drop your line in, and you start to reel something in, and it turns out to be a moose. That would give a whole new slant on the idea of big game fishing, right? So, but yeah, I mean, again, the native people are very blasé about these things. Oh yeah, they even have a name for it. I forget what the name means. Moose that swims in the water or something like that. Very blasé about it, but yeah, this thing definitely exists, and these folks that were commercial fishermen pulled one of these things out of the water. So, until somebody drops one in at the local zoology or biology department of their local Canadian university, I guess we're still going to be wondering about the mystery of that thing.
Yeah, it's possible it could be some kind of weird subspecies of moose that just likes to live underwater. And moose are really big, though. I would just think it would be so noticeable and just.
Yeah, I mean, the moose is the second largest land animal in North America after the bison, which weighs more than a moose, but isn't nearly as tall as a moose.
Right.
People die in Canada every year from hitting moose because they'll take the top right off your car because of how tall they stand.
Have you seen one up there?
I have not seen one yet. I have not. I'm hoping to get up to the Algonquin region. There's a provincial park north of me that, wolves, moose, loons, and all that kind of stuff. And it's not too far from here, actually. It's maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours from where I'm sitting right now. So, you can get out into real deep wilderness real quick here.
Yeah. Like we were talking about before, there's like 30 million people in Canada, and there's like most of them live 100 miles within the U.S. border. So
yeah.
The other wilderness.
Yeah, exactly. The other interesting thing too, speaking of bison, is everybody's like, well, all of the areas of the world have been explored, and there's nowhere for a Sasquatch to hide, right? That's not really true because, we managed to lose a whole species of bison for several decades in the early part of the 20th century. The wood bison, which is a very large subspecies of the plains bison that everybody knows from the States, right? These guys are even a little bit bigger than the plains bison, right? The wood bison was declared extinct. I forget what year that was in, but it was declared extinct because of brucellosis and overhunting and so on and so forth. 1957, a Manitoba conservation officer is flying over the forest in a wilderness area, looks down out of his plane, and darn if there aren't 200 of those big boys running across the field underneath him. As it turns out, Canada houses a population of about 10,000 wood bison. So they're, it's an actual, they call them Lazarus species, where you thought it was extinct, but it really isn't, kind of like the coelacanth. So the wood bison is actually a Lazarus species that exists right here in Canada, and its size is comparable to what people describe a Sasquatch being. So who knows? Who knows what's running around out in the forest here?
That's true. What's interesting is that in the eastern United States in the 18th century, there were bison in the eastern U.S., but they got hunted out very quickly. And there are actually here close to me at a place called Land Between the Lakes. It's this area between the Cumberland River and the Tennessee River.
Yeah, famous for its Dogman sightings.
Yes, it is.
The creature of the land between the lakes. I know this story well.
They're trying to reintroduce the buffalo back into the eastern United States. How well it's going, I don't know, but they actually are. I've been there. I think I was there in like June or July, and the bison looked miserable. They looked like they were not having a good time.
Just too hot for them, huh? Yeah. So yeah. I mean, the bison obviously existed in the eastern U.S. Part of the reason that the Lakota, the people that most people know them as Sioux, native people, ended up out on the Great Plains was they were following the buffalo as they made their exit out of the eastern United States, because their primary food source, up until the late 1800s, their primary food source was bison.
Yep.
So
almost lost them completely too.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
But
they tried to extinguish the bison population in hopes that they could extinguish the Indian populations as well.
Right. Yeah. There's an unreal picture of just a mound of bison skulls or bones and from that time period. Let's get into Dogman since we've mentioned him a little bit here. The whole idea of the Dogman, you've got this going on in Canada too. This has become extraordinarily popular. In fact, in about a month, there is a Dogman conference taking place here in Tennessee.
Yeah, I saw that.
But you start this little section off with the Lugaru, this the
Lugaru. Yeah.
Lugaru, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the Lugaru, the mythology behind it, how it's similar to the Dogman type.
Yeah, so there were in Europe, of course, legends of the werewolf, and but there were regional variations of what the werewolf was all about, right? In Germany, and places along that line, the werewolf was this basically it was a demonically possessed person who, was granted the power by Satan to change into a wolf. And, it went around, ravaging and pillaging wherever it went, right? The Loup-garou, which is the French version of the werewolf, was much more genteel. For one thing, the French, who of course are both I don't know about now modern day France and Europe, but the French Canadians are predominantly Catholic, Roman Catholic people. And the mythology of the Loup-garou was tied into their faith. So one became a Loup-garou as a result of some kind of religious failing. You weren't going to mass like you should. You didn't go to confession when you were supposed to, that sort of thing. And the curse was not permanent. You were fated to become a wolf for X number of nights, and then the curse ended. I can't remember the number of 90 days or something like that. I don't remember the exact number of days now. It might have been a half a year or something. And there was nothing about the full moon or any of that silliness, right? So these Loup-garou would become wolves at night, but they seem to maintain more of their human sensibilities than the German werewolf did. Attacks on humans were fairly rare, but they didn't do anybody's livestock any good, because, Loup-garou's got to eat, right? There's an interesting little story that comes from a CBC radio documentary thing that I picked up about a hunter in the 1800s who was actually a Loup-garou, had become a Loup-garou, and his apprentice. And, he was worried that he was going to hurt his apprentice, and he was trying to get this boy to leave. But the boy had been given some protection against the Loup-garou, and he decided he was going to trust in this, right? The other interesting thing about the Loup-garou mythos is that if you draw blood from this wolf and say its name, its human name, then the curse is broken. So this is precisely what happens in the story. This Loup-garou, is overcome by his ravenous sensibilities and comes on this young man who's wearing his protection that he's been given by the Loup-garou. The young man manages to prick him with a knife and say his name and breaks the curse. But the interesting part about that whole curse breaking thing is that the curse only remains broken as long as neither the Lugaru or the person that saved them ever says anything about it. If either one of them tells the story, then the curse is reinstated and the individual becomes a Lugaru again. So it's an interesting, very weird sort of regional variance that, now I've researched werewolves in Germany and so forth pretty extensively for some fiction work and stuff that I've done. Never ran across anything like that story before. So it's interesting that you would have that sort of off switch, and then this strange on switch again. But to demonstrate that the Lugaru might actually have a heart, there's a story of a Cree man who was trapped out in a bad storm in the wintertime, and was very concerned that he was going to freeze to death. And this giant black wolf materializes out of the snow, and he figures, well, I guess better to get eaten by a wolf than freeze to death. But the wolf comes and lays down next to him, keeps him warm, and then actually guides him to a human settlement after the weather clears a bit. Which reminded me very much of some of the Phantom Black Dog stories that I ran across when I was doing research in that area. It was interesting. He makes a point. This fellow makes a point of talking about how this creature's eyes glowed, and that's how he knew it was a supernatural being. Which that's kind of one of the Tim Renner signs of the paranormal. Glowing eyes. Self-illuminating eyes.
It's a hallmark of it, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, there's that story. There's another somewhat scarier story of fellow who's again, this is in the 1800s, who lived on his own out, and he was basically what do you call that? He was basically a squatter. He had occupied a particular section of land, and he had started working it and so forth. And that was kind of how you got your land back in that particular time period. He's also a very devout fellow, right? Another very devout Roman Catholic fellow. And I'm trying to think if it was the mail sled or something. It was the dead of winter again. Somebody comes by his cabin and mentions that his neighbor down the road, which is like several miles away, is on the point of passing away. And, this fellow, being, again, a very devout Roman Catholic, and knowing that there's no priest within, probably 100 miles, grabs his prayer book and jumps in his sled and, takes off to go at least hear this fellow's last words and say a blessing over him before he dies, right? He's riding along his sled, and this giant black wolf again comes bolting out of the forest and gives chase. And, of course, there's this religious overtone to the story, with the fellow praying desperately to make it to his neighbor's home. And, he basically outruns this wolf in his sled, which that's not likely to happen, right? It's a single horse drawn sled. He gets to the neighbor's house. He runs in the door, and he props his prayer book on the table, blocking the doorway, and so of course the Lugaru can't get in, right? And he does what he says he's going to do. He comes in, he hears this fellow's last words basically, and says prayers over him and all that sort of thing. It's not the last rites that Roman Catholic would prefer, but it's better than nothing. And the fellow passes on. And by the time all this happens, this Lugaru has disappeared. But again, you get the whole, we know it's a supernatural creature because its eyes glow. So, the Lugaru has kind of a spotty reputation, but it's not nearly as bloodthirsty as the Germanic werewolf. there are some stories in the book about the Lugaru and the mythology there.
So we have this concept, this myth, really like kind of like a folklore with the Lugaru. Mm-hmm. And of course, you have the French settlement in Canada, the Quebec. You've also got the Métis people that are in, I think, Manitoba, Saskatchewan.
Métis, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That they're kind of a mixed native or First Nations, as you call them up there, and descendants of French, like the trappers and that whole thing. Mm-hmm. So you've got a lot of this kind of like that French cultural influence.
Oh yeah.
And then you've got a lot of these kind of encounters, the Dogman stuff, in which you've got the same kind of French cultural influence in Michigan and Wisconsin as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
So do you think that there's a connection to some of this cultural influence and these sightings?
That's tough to say. I mean, I think that it's certainly that goes back to, what are these things?
Right.
Whether you call it man wolf, whether you call it a dog man, whether you call it a werewolf, whatever you call it, you come back to that question. What is this thing? Now, is it and there are as many theories about that as there are people that research this subject, ranging from, supernatural guardian that was put in place to guard burial mounds of native peoples in, the United States to, a mutant wolf that evolved to walk on 2 feet and maybe develop more superior intelligence. I mean, the theories about what these things are, there's a wide continuum of belief. Now, if we go with a more supernatural or psi kind of explanation for these critters, then certainly you have a situation where you have a group of people, because if you want to form a thought form, you have to have will, desire, and imagination, right? You have a group of people that have a particular being that produces fear in them. So you have the energy to power this thing, a very clear idea of what this thing looks like. And and again, that fear energy, this, or energy of awe, whatever it is that goes into this creature, so that it may be that in some way that those thoughts, that acculturation is actually creating a form of some type. Now, whether these things are actually physically solid and there or not remains to be seen for the most part. But it could be that some people are having spontaneous psychic experiences that are brought on by this kind of, if you want to call it an egregore or a group soul kind of experience of this creature. I hesitate to say that that's true. Because most of the Lugaru stories that I ran across were of people who actually turned into wolves. And you could distinguish the wolf by the fact that its eyes glowed. It didn't turn into a bipedal, upright, walking around on 2 legs wolf.
Yeah, it's not your classic werewolf kind of thing that you see in the movies now. Right.
Yeah. Right. Everybody knows this thing now because, you see them in movies and all this stuff all the time, right? It's like, it's a thing.
Yeah.
So I think there must be something deeper, more mysterious to a lot of these sightings. Now, some of the sightings that you run across are of, just a really gigundous bipedal or quadrupedal wolf creature that people just don't have the feeling is a natural wolf. But most of the sightings, the distinguishing characteristic of this thing is that it is bipedal, or it becomes bipedal. There's a couple of stories in the book where people have gone hiking. They're out in the Canadian wilderness. In one case, the folks were armed. In fact, both cases, the folks were armed. And this large wolf appears to these people, which freaks them out bad enough. And then as they're watching, this thing stands up on its hind legs, which of course really freaks them out. In one case, fellow, fired off a shotgun, and the creature looked at him like, that's not going to hurt me, right? In another case, fellow, was carrying a .22 rifle with him and put 3 rounds in this thing's chest, and it didn't even blink. It just made savage noises at him. The interesting thing about both of those stories, if I'm recalling my stories correctly, is that what got rid of this thing was somebody getting a camera out.
Right.
As soon as they tried to get a camera out to take a picture of it, it disappeared back into the woods. And in one case, the woman had a very clear psychic impression that if she tried to take a picture of this creature, it was going to kill her and her husband both. So it's something, in my mind, much stranger even than, some kind of a thought form from, French culture, coming to life. These things are one of the things that distinguishes the Dogman man-wolf from like a Sasquatch for the most part is the aggressiveness of these guys. They don't care if you see them. They have a bad attitude. And they're not afraid to show it. Linda Godfrey has a story that comes out of Quebec that the fellow claims that he doesn't think the creature intended to harm him, but as it went by, he was again hiking in a wilderness area, encountered one of these creatures, and it dropped down on all fours and went speeding by him, and apparently snagged his hip on its teeth as it went by. It gave him a very sizable laceration, according to, she had trouble getting hold of him after his initial report. So kind of hard to know how much stock to place in the story, but according to him, he got quite a number of stitches. He told the local paramedics he'd been attacked by a bear. But again, it's like with the Sasquatch thing where people say, but I know that wasn't a bear. So, but that's in all of Godfrey's research, that's the only story that she had where somebody was actually injured by one of these things. Now, they've scared the bejeebies out of who knows how many people, but they seem to be pretty territorial. They seem to be given to like a bluff charge where they'll come at you to try to scare you off their territory. And most people are quite happy to oblige them by running like crazy, which actually, if we're talking about a real predator, they'd probably run you down and eat you.
And that's one of the things that Timothy Renner likes to point out with the Dogman stuff, is that you have Bigfoot, and Bigfoot is weird enough. There's a lot of weirdness around Bigfoot, but Bigfoot is not anatomically impossible. Bigfoot is very much like us. He has 2 arms, 2 legs. He's a primate. He's a possible being. Okay. You don't have to stretch your belief too much to say, well, Bigfoot could be out there. Yeah. But with the Dogman stuff, you've got this upright canine that's walking on these little legs, and it almost does seem anatomically impossible that this creature could actually exist.
Yeah, you have descriptions from the witnesses of these things having, walking around bipedally on legs like a dog.
Right.
Now, it's possible for a dog to get up on its back legs and, they do the cute little dance thing and stuff, right? I mean, my small dog does that sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, but they can't sustain it.
But they can't.
No.
They can't walk for any length of time on those legs like that. And they sure as heck can't run. And people describe these things as moving quickly through the woods.
On 2 legs.
On 2 legs, yeah. And then, being able to drop into four-wheel drive and then really take off, right? Anatomically, it's not tenable, and then you add in all of the weirdness with things like the anuboid type dog people that appear in people's bedrooms and stuff. And you're like, wait a minute, what? How did that happen?
Materialize,
Yeah.
and then dematerialize.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's like it's there 1 minute, and the next minute it's gone. Then you start getting into more almost the Phantom Black Dog apparitional type being, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's just it's another great mystery that I don't think anybody's ever going to drag a Dogman in and plop it on a table in their basement and give it up to science. It's just, I think there's something far, far stranger going on there.
Got a couple of stories in the book, a chapter called The Headless Valley. I believe this is related to the
Wahilah,
to Dogman. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the cool things about doing research is that you find out that stories that you have read in passing about places or events may not be necessarily the way everybody thinks they are. Now, in the Headless Valley, in the Nahanni Valley, it's up in the Northwest Territories, a very isolated spot, is one of those things. It's one of those stories that has kind of gotten confabulated, so that the myth out there right now, if you go on the website, you look up Headless Valley or Nahanni, or go on the web and look up Headless Valley, the Nahanni Valley, any of that kind of stuff. You'll get this story about the giant wolves and they're eating people's heads off and stuff, right? And that's not necessarily true. In fact, it's probably not true. A guy named Pierre Berton wrote a book in the early part of the 20th century, The Mysterious North. I'm thinking that's the name of it. It's in the bibliography of my book. So the Nahanni Valley had acquired this reputation in sort of the yellow journalism of the time as sort of this Shangri-La of the North, right? It's like it was supposed to be like this tropical valley where ancient civilizations, carvings. It's kind of like one of those Journey to the Center of the Earth kind of things, right? From Jules Verne, with its native queen and all of this stuff, right? So Berton decided that he was going to get somebody to fly him into this valley. And immediately the native people and anybody who'd been there, who'd trapped there, who'd hunted there, anybody who'd spent any time in this valley told him that's a really bad idea. You don't want to do that. He persevered, and he actually got a pilot to fly him into the valley, and he gives this wonderful sort of spooky description of the place with its constant wind blowing through the valley and so forth. But what he points out is, or what he says when he wrote this book in the 30s, I believe, 30s or 40s, something along that line. What he says is that, yes, these prospectors who'd gone into the valley had turned up without their heads. And he said that the First Nations people in that area had told him that there were a tribe of people that lived in the valley that were taking these folks' heads. Now, flash forward a couple of 3 decades to Ivan Sanderson, who is a renowned cryptozoologist, very famous for his work on the Yeti or the abominable snowman, and many other mysterious things. He was quite the writer himself. Sanderson tells a story of meeting a fellow who was a diesel mechanic or something, who went on a hunting expedition into this valley with a native guide, and he his his guide went into a copse of trees to see if he could flush some game out. And this fellow, Frank, I think his name was Frank, but don't quote me on that. This fellow is standing there with his big old shotgun waiting for something to come out, and something does come out. It is a humongous white wolf, bigger than anything he's ever seen before, from a wolf species. And he's been hunting in Canada for years and years. He unloads on this thing with his shotgun full of bird shot and heavy shot and so forth. And as with the giant wolf thing at Skinwalker Ranch, it just kind of blinks at him and runs off, right? So his friend, his guide, comes out and he asks what he was shooting at. And he tells him, and he's like, he gets real quiet. And it takes a while before he finally tells this fella, that wasn't a wolf, that was the Wahilah. It's different. It's a giant wolf that roams the tundra up here, and it scavenges. It avoids regular wolves, and it spends a lot of time scavenging their kills and stuff like that. Now, somehow, this story gets confabulated with the Nahanni Valley, and this giant wolf becomes the bad guy in this story, the thing that's taking these people's heads. When in fact, the native people of the area said that there was a tribe of people who were doing this. Now, whether these people were people like human people, like Homo sapiens, or whether they were something else is a subject of conjecture. But the native people in that area did not equate whatever casualties there were in that area with the great wolves. So I spend a little time talking about that in the book, because that's one of those things, again, like I said, if you go online and you look up the Nahanni Valley, you'll see that story all over the place. Oh yes, there's these fierce wolves and they're taking people's heads and blah, blah, blah. It's like, nah, probably not. Because first of all, a very large predator like that, if it's gonna take the trouble to attack you and kill you, it's gonna eat you. It's not just going to snip your head off and then go on and leave your body laying there. It's going to eat you, or at least eat the good bits, right? So, livers and the fatty, rich, nutrient dense parts of our bodies, right? It's not just going to snip your head off and then walk away. The same with any kind of predator, whether you're talking about bears or wolves or mountain lions or whatever. They don't just kill things and, snip their heads off and leave them laying there. They eat them, because that's the whole purpose of the hunt, right? So, the Wahilah gets a bad reputation. And the existence of this creature is kind of a little doubtful, because we only really have that one story of the Wahilah. It's not until we descend south of the border into Linda Godfrey country, again into the Wisconsin, Minnesota area, that we come across another critter that she documents that she called a bear wolf, which is again this enormous wolf-like creature that appears sometimes on roadsides. There's one really great story. This poor fella, talk about having a bad night. His wife's in labor. He's trying to get her to the hospital. It's snowing like crazy. And as he's driving along in his car, this huge, I think it was white. I think this one was actually white. I could be mistaken. This huge white creature that looks like a giant wolf with kind of stubby legs comes up and runs along the side of the road next to him. And his impression is that the thing is trying to nudge his car with the shoulder. Maybe it was hoping to get a free snack. So as it turns out, the beast, whatever it was, runs into his car and ends up, getting kind of tangled with the car and bounces off of it and rolls off into the snow, and he drives on his way as quickly as he can in the snow. But Godfrey, theorizes that the things that kind of from the historical record that these critters could be are either dire wolves, or which was again one of those creatures that existed not too long ago, or something called an amphision, which seems to be the best candidate, but which existed some millions of years ago. But still, I have trouble believing that there's a breeding population of these giant, bear wolves or whatever you want to call them running around out there that nobody's discovered. When I read stories like this, I almost wonder sometimes. Did you ever see the BBC show Primeval?
No, but I'm familiar with what you're talking about.
Yeah. So in this show, they have what they call anomalies. We might call them portals or windows or whatever. And, prehistoric creatures come through these anomalies, or sometimes creatures from the future come through these anomalies. And, of course, they wreak havoc. And this team's whole job is to get these things back into the anomalies and seal the anomalies, right? I have to wonder sometimes if something like that doesn't happen, where something from the past ends up in our timeline for a short period of time and then maybe goes back.
Right. The direwolves, it's very similar also to the giant beaver stuff too. I mean, is that what's going on? Both of them are not supposed to be here. They were here, geologically speaking, not too long ago.
Well, yeah. I mean, even something like the amphision, which is probably my best candidate for the bear wolf because it's massive, and it looks like what you visualize when they're describing these creatures to you, right?
Right.
Even something like that only existed maybe 10 million years ago. That's a blink of an eye in geological terms. So I have to wonder. We know that that there are alternate dimensions. Who's to say time is a construct that we use. Who's to say that time doesn't get bollocksed up periodically and, dump something that's not supposed to be in our time stream on us? That's as good an explanation to me as oh yes, it's a relic population of a creature that's supposed to have died out 10 million years ago. Sure, it could be. You could be right. But there could be something else even weirder going on too.
As we kind of wind down here, let's talk a little bit about some of the more bizarre stuff. Not that any of this isn't bizarre, but more bizarre.
No, I think giant white wolves running around the tundra of Canada is pretty bizarre.
But this one's really bizarre. Merfolk, mermaids, mermen. So you actually have a chapter about this in the book.
Yep. And here is my counsel to you. If you ever run into a mermaid or a merman or a mer being, mer person, whatever you want to call them, don't mess with them. Okay.
I've heard that
perfectly.
Before, yes.
Yeah, they're perfectly happy to sun themselves on a rock, and if they see somebody, they'll fling themselves into the water. No harm done. But there's a story in the book about a fellow who's exploring. This is back in the colonial period of Canada. He was on one of the lakes. I forget which one. Huron, I think. He had a native woman with him. And they spot this mermaid, just swimming in the water, that had the appearance of a young maiden, and then the fishtail, the whole thing, right? Just like you would expect a mermaid to look. And this fellow is pretty dumbfounded for a minute, and he just kind of stands there with his mouth open, and then for whatever reason, this idiot decides that he's going to shoot this thing. Maybe he thought he was going to bring it back to his king and be rewarded or something. I have no idea why he would do something like that. His native companion loses their crap. As soon as he gets his rifle out, she just loses it on him and starts wrestling him for the rifle and yelling at him that he can't possibly mean to harm one of the gods of the lake. And she basically succeeds in wrestling his rifle away from him, and then gets on a boat and hauls it for shore and just leaves them there, right? So they've lost their guide. They get back up on shore. They pitch camp. It's Lake Superior. That's what it was, because it's the place where the Edmund Fitzgerald sunk. They pitch their camp, and they've retired for the night. And the mother of all storms blows in. They end up having a really bad night because they have to pick up their camp in the rain and move it farther up the shore to avoid being drowned, basically, because the lake is rising so high. The lake is literally coming for them. And, you can say, oh, well, that was just coincidence. Sure it was. The guy decides he's going to take a shot at what's clearly a supernatural being. And then the lake just decides to try and eat him that night. Just don't mess with them. The other thing that you find, and I don't have any recorded stories of this, but the other thing that you find in the mermaid lore is that these beings seem to be capable of seducing people into the water and drowning them. Again, just don't mess with it. If you see it, sit down, have a cup of tea, take notes. Maybe you can sneak a picture in. I don't know how they feel about that. But don't mess with this creature if you see one, because, storms and disaster follow surely afterwards.
I will definitely keep that in mind if I ever encounter a mermaid.
Interesting thing is John Warms also documents a number of mer people. I don't know what to call them, mer being sightings. And the interesting thing is that a lot of these native folk actually are seeing the classic mermaid, and classic in that it is Caucasian. It's a white person basically with red or blonde hair. Now, why on earth would First Nations people be seeing something like that?
Now, in their traditions, are they saying that they've seen these?
Yeah, it's not, as far as I know.
Yeah,
as far as I know, it's not a really traditional thing. Although the reaction of the native person in that one story seems to indicate that they knew these creatures existed. But why would they be blonde and red-haired? You would think that, because most myths, the humanoid creatures tend to look like the humans that are telling them.
Right.
In this case,
correct.
Not so much. In this case, not so much. And these stories are fairly recent, where, a young lady goes, when she was a child, she used to go to the lake, and they would go swimming, and they'd try to swim underwater. Whoever could swim underwater the longest won, right? And she was underwater and saw one of these things. And, she told John Worms, it's like, after that, I never went in the deep water again.
You talk also in the book about fairy lore in Canada, which I found it interesting that you spelled it F-A-E-R-Y. Is that more a correct spelling than F-A-I-R-Y? Yeah,
part of the reason that I do that is I like to differentiate these beings from, there's a couple of reasons why I do this. One, it's the way one of my teachers spelled it. I've had some contact with a guy who's a Scottish fairy seer, basically, and that's how he spells it. So that's one reason. The other reason is I want to differentiate these beings from the Tinkerbell thing that everybody visualizes when they think of a fairy.
Right.
The fairy beings, whether you're talking about Celtic fairy lore or whether you're talking about the fairy lore of Canada, are very powerful spirits that have a basically humanoid shape a lot of times, although, in vision, you can run into all kinds of strange things in the fairy lands. But so I really want to make it clear to people that I'm not talking about Tinkerbell. So this is part of the reason why I use that kind of alternative spelling. But yeah, the fairy lore, particularly of Newfoundland, has been the subject of academic study. There's a wonderful woman named Barbara Rieti who's got a doctorate in, I don't know, I think folklore or something like that, who wrote a whole book called Strange Terrain, which is all about the fairy lore of Newfoundland. And she has actual witness stories of people who encountered these beings in Newfoundland, and some of the beliefs around them. They're up until even recently, like the 1960s, there was still a belief in some parts of Newfoundland in changelings, which were, the story is that the fairy will substitute one of their babies, or sometimes an old fairy that looks like a baby, for a human child. Nobody in any of the lore has ever been really clear about why they do that, but it's a pretty universal fairy story or mythology. Well, in this particular case, these people had a young child that had just been born recently. The child's behavior changed very quickly, and it became more sullen and unhappy. It had been a very happy baby up until that time. And they decided that, that the kid was a changeling. So Dad put the baby on a shovel over a fire and told, this is a very standard fairy mythology or fairy lore thing to do, told the fairy that if they didn't give him his child back, he was going to dump this changeling in fire. And abruptly, the changeling disappears, and he can hear his own child crying inside the house. So, and this story is supposed to have happened in the 60s. It was related to Rieti by someone was a relative of the people that it happened to. So it was secondhand, but still interesting story. There's also one of the classic kind of tropes of fairy lore is the idea of being fairy-led. And the fairy in Newfoundland do this in a very odd way. It's not so much that you're being fairy-led, it's that you're being fairy-blocked. There's a couple of stories in the book about people who were traveling paths that they were familiar with and suddenly came upon a forest that hadn't been there before. In one of these stories, the two young ladies that encounter this forest, go in a little ways, and they're trying to figure out where these trees came from and what they should do. They run back to their relative's house and they tell them what's going on. And they're like, oh, well, basically they said, you took the wrong road. The North Road belongs to the fairies and the South Road belongs to us. But if you need to go that way, then here's what you do. So they gave them, they blessed them with holy water, which is a classic preventative for being taken by the fairy, which is another thing that happens. And they gave them a loaf of bread to take with them. And when they got to these trees, they were instructed to start, casting the bread out around them. So again, if you read fairy lore in the Celtic countries, the people often left, the farm folk often left offerings out for the fairy beings in their area to, encourage good relations and keep them from destroying their crops and killing their livestock and all that sort of thing. So same sort of thing. These young girls were flinging this bread around, and suddenly this forest that had been there just disappears, and they go on their way. Very, very interesting.
Well, the people in Newfoundland and the Atlantic provinces, they are primarily Celtic, right? They come from Scotland,
Right, yeah.
Ireland.
Nova Scotia is, very much Scottish heritage. And then Newfoundland, same
New
thing.
Scotland.
You got a lot of Scots and
a
lot of northern folk, northern European folk. There's another story from Lon Strickler about again, takes place in a Newfoundland provincial park, and these two young ladies. It always seems to be two young ladies for some reason. Went camping with their parents, and they went to this provincial park, and they got their camp all set up, and they were all good to go, and they were all happy with their campsite and so forth. They asked their parents if they could go down to the beach. And, sure, be back in a couple of hours, for dinner or whatever. So these two young ladies, and it was a clear day. So these two young ladies are walking along the path to the beach, and suddenly it gets foggy. This relates right back to, Mysteries in the Mist. It gets foggy, and they have that experience of the silence where everything goes quiet, right? Another one of those paranormal markers that Tim Renner talks about. Or Jenny Randles talks about too. So it gets very quiet, and they're seeing movement out of the corner of their eye, which is a classic fairy thing. If you ever talk to somebody who associates with fairy beings, or you read something like Robert Kirk's The Secret Commonwealth, oftentimes they'll tell you that you can't look directly at the fairy, you can only see them out of the corner of your eye. In any event, they're seeing movement in the ferns and stuff, but they can't figure out what's going on. So they go down to this beach. It's foggy. It's kind of yick, right? There's a man standing down there. And, it's the 80s. It's Canada. They're like, hi, how are you? Blah, blah, blah. No response. He just stands and looks off out onto the water. So they start to get creeped out and decide, maybe we'll go back to camp. And this is where things really get strange. This is where you get this kind of fairy-led phenomenon. These two young ladies get on this path, and suddenly they're in a forest that they don't recognize. Have no idea where they are. And, they thought they were on the path to go back up from the beach to their campsite. They wander for some period of time, and eventually they come out on a road. And the older girl says, I know where we are. I know if we go this way, we'll get back to the campsite. So sure enough, they follow this road. They get back to the camping area. Their mother and father are frantic. It's like, where have you been? It's like, what do you mean? We've only been gone for an hour. It's like, no. They'd been gone for 5 hours.
Missing time. Yeah.
So they had some time that was either missing or there was a mislocation of time, right? Their mother had been up and down the path that they were supposed to be on a number of times and never saw them. The only way other than that path to get back up into the campsite led through dense forest and brambles and thickets and bushes, and so they should have been all scratched up. Didn't have a scratch on them. Yeah. But they made it back to the camp. They were 5 hours late for where they were. They told their story, and they were like, well, okay. It's like, don't go to the beach again. Because Dad had stayed with the camper, and Mom had gone up and down and up and down and up and down looking for these two and could not find them anywhere. So again, you have that example of being what they call fairy-led. And like I said, it's not unheard of. There was a story in the book about someone who was fairy taken, actually taken by the fairy, taken into the other world. And it's very difficult to get somebody back after that happens. You have to know specific, in that particular story, both times the person who tried to bring the young girl back from fairy spoke before they should have and lost her back to the fairy realm. And this is, again, a story out of Newfoundland. It's not that old. So, when I read those stories, I often think about all those missing 411 cases out there where people disappear mysteriously into the forest.
There's a lot of there's a lot of parallels to all that material.
I think that, Paulides has done a fantastic job of documenting a bunch of really weird stuff. As a former search and rescue volunteer, I can tell you that, it's entirely possible for somebody to disappear in the wilderness and not be found, and it's just natural causes. But, there's enough really strange stories in his books, people disappearing from the ends of ropes and things like that, you have to wonder, what people are encountering out there that's making them go poof.
Right. Disappear into the mist.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Travis, this has been awesome. I've really enjoyed having you on and talking about all this weird stuff that's in Canada. And we barely scratched the surface really on any of this. So, like we didn't even really talk about the lake monsters, which you have a significant portion of the book about. So you guys will just have to buy the book to hear that. So, but
if you want to hear about lake monsters and UFOs, there's large sections of both in the book. So if your interest lies in those areas,
flying humanoids as well.
Yeah, got some flying humanoids. We got some other flying critters.
Where can people get your book, Canadian Monsters and Mysteries?
So the book is on Amazon. Like all the Beyond the Fray books, it's on Amazon. It's available on Kindle and as a paperback. Also, it's available on Kindle Unlimited if you have that subscription service. So, it's pretty easy to get your hands on. And like I said, we really did just touch the surface. There's phantom ships. There's ghost trains. There's fire spooks and all kinds of other interesting Fortean stuff in the book. So if you have an interest in the paranormal, a lot like Mysteries in the Mist, you're probably going to find something that you really dig in this book.
Excellent. Well, I really enjoyed the book, and hopefully you guys can get it as well. And we talked a little bit about this though, but what's next for you on the agenda?
So as I said, right now I'm up to my neck in Sasquatch sightings in Canada. The working title of the book is Beyond BC, because I'm filtering out all of the things in British Columbia, because obviously that's a huge sighting area. The native people there, have different names for Sasquatch, but that's a big sighting area, and I think it's been covered pretty thoroughly in other books about Sasquatch. However, what I discovered very quickly when I started doing the research for this book is that the mainstream cryptozoological Bigfoot type books that you run into out there don't have a lot of Canadian sightings in them. Canadian sightings will be mentioned in passing, but then people go back over to the Pacific Northwest, sometimes into British Columbia. There's a ton of information in Ontario, a ton in Manitoba, a ton in Alberta. And then I've literally found Bigfoot sightings in every province in Canada. So my aim is to put together a book or books on the Sasquatch outside of BC.
All right, excellent. And where can people find you?
You can find me on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. Facebook is, I have a W.T. Watson author page, or if you want to get on my personal Facebook, it's Will Watson. Long story there. On Twitter, I'm at WT Watson 2, and on Instagram, I am Curunir, Curunir 60. Again, another long story, but. So, I am always happy to interact with people who've read the books, who have questions, who have witness testimony. I've had a couple of people approach me with Black Dog stories since I published the Phantom Black Dog books. haven't had any other strange stories, but I'm sure that'll happen at some point. But I'm always happy to interact with readers and answer any questions that I can.
All right. Well, excellent. Just holding the line for me just a bit as I close out the show.
Sure.
Guys, I want to thank everybody for listening. I thank Travis WT for being on. And of course, the usual spiel, guys. Patreon.com/Conspirinormal. You guys can go on there. We've got a lot of different extra stuff going all the way back to the end of 2016. So you guys can join that for $5. And there's several different tiers. And we're going to have the next Strange Realities online event going on with Mr. Joshua Cutchin, who we're interviewing next week. That's July 22nd. And of course, don't forget to get your tickets for Strange Realities Conference going on October 14th through the 16th here in Nashville, Tennessee. So we'll catch you on the other side next week on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.